Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted tonight that we have Joanna O'Loan with us. She is a knowledge manager at Energy Savings Trust, and she says herself that since 2019, she's been helping people to understand and adopt energy efficiency and zero carbon technologies. And that's a mixture of research, analysis, writing, training, and giving advice through the Energy Savings Trust. And if you've never looked at the Energy Savings Trust website, it's an absolute fountain of knowledge on all things energy saving. So it's a really good source of info. Now, Joanna is really likes the opportunities that net zero brings to improve our homes. And I think that's a really big thing, is that we all think it's purely about carbon, but actually a lot of the technologies can improve our comfort and our health and our quality of life. She has a background in chemical engineering, lifelong curiosity about how things work, and she's very passionate about making complex topics accessible. She's a regular speaker on this topic, and we are very pleased to say we have her here, given she's been on BBC's Morning Live, BBC's Sliced Bread, which I know very well, the podcast, the Big Green Money programme, as well as she's had pieces in the Times, the FT, and the Sun. So she's covered all the bases. She lives in Edinburgh and she has installed a heat pump in her own home. So we have very much not only an expert from what I would call a learning point of view, but from a real hands-on expert. We're going to run this as a Q&A sessions, but just to get us warmed up, I'm going to ask her a few questions that we think will generally get the conversation started. And then we'll go on and take your questions, which, as Jane says, please put your questions in the chat. Jane will feed them to me and to Joanna. So, Joanna, the first question is, what are the low carbon fossil fuel free heating choices that we've got? Is it all
Yes,
heat pumps?
it's a very good question. And I think it's something that we quite often jump to chatting about heat pumps already, and we don't necessarily always do that explaining beforehand. And I know I'm guilty of it as well, is just going straight to chat about heat pumps and the pros and cons and who they're for and all that kind of thing. And we don't necessarily always take that step back to kind of understand where we've got. And if I spoke to Jane briefly before, and she was happy to indulge me a little bit in some presentation sharing. So I'm going to do that just to answer some of these questions a bit better. So hopefully if I press this button, this has appeared on your screen, so you should see someone checking their thermostat in their room, their programmer thermostat in their room in there. And if I click this button, hopefully it goes into the next thing. So I know this audience know very well about the challenges of the climate emergency and net zero and the ambitions that countries have. But just to re-emphasize really that climate change really is one of the biggest challenges facing us today. That rising level of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are what's driving global warming, and we're seeing the impacts already on our weather and our ecosystems and global health outcomes as well. And obviously lots of countries, most countries have committed themselves to net zero at least by 2050, although some countries have adopted earlier dates for this. Now, that's going to require a rapid decarbonisation in all sectors of our society. Here, I've listed the UK's greenhouse gas emissions by source, so from UK government statistics. And you'll see residential buildings are around 15%. So 15% of our total emissions that we're producing every year in the UK are coming from our residences. And if I click this next button here, I wanted to dig a little bit more about, well, what does residences mean? Is it me throwing away my banana skins, and is it me watching telly, and what is this residence thing? Well, really most of that other stuff is captured under maybe waste, or my car might be under personal transport, or me throwing that banana skin might be captured under waste. Me watching the telly will be captured under energy supply. So what that 15% is actually describing, 97% of that is just fuel combustion, which is largely just heating our homes and our hot water. So providing heat and hot water to our homes in the UK is responsible for 15% of our total emissions, or almost 15% of our total emissions. So something about what we're doing in our homes isn't working, and we need to change that. So most of our combustion at home is for keeping warm. So space heating takes up the majority of that. Hot water is a smaller number, but it's a steady year-round need. We all need warm water for bathing and washing up and yeah, having hot water at home. And cooking is also a small amount, but it is there. A small share. Cooking with gas does represent a small amount of combustion. So we need to change how we're heating our homes. And for most of us, that's with gas-fired main heating. So around 86% of homes in the UK are currently using a gas boiler to provide their heating and hot water. Around 8% are using electric heating. There are still, and particularly in kind of more rural off-gas areas, lots of oil-fired systems out there as well. And there are some communal district heating and heat networks, but it's not a very common way to heat homes in the UK. It is a bit more mainstream in other countries, but it's this kind of big gas-fired main heating that we're trying to change. It's really the big one that will give us the biggest shift, the biggest volume in terms of changing. So what options are there to the person that currently heats their home with the gas boilers is kind of the question. I think that's really your question there, Rosie, was what is the question? To me, it's all about electricity. So right now, if you heat your home with oil, you're responsible for around about 4 tons of carbon dioxide every year into the atmosphere. If you heat your home with gas, you're responsible for around about 2.8 tons of carbon dioxide each year. If you heat that home with electricity, it's about 2.6 tons of carbon dioxide each year. And if you heat your home with a heat pump, you're responsible for about 0.8 tons of carbon dioxide each year. So if you today were to sit and choose a heating system purely based on the lowest carbon emissions that you could be totally responsible for, you would opt for a heat pump. That is our lowest carbon emissions heating system available of the tools that we've got to us today. So this is quite often why this one is flagged as the front runner. But this is based on today's statics. So if oil, in order to calculate the emissions here for our average space heating, we burn oil and we count the amount of emissions that come out of that burning that oil, similarly with gas. But with electricity and with the heat pump, in order to calculate its emissions, because it's not actually combusting anything, it's not burning anything at source, it's using electricity. And so we need to look at electricity's carbon, what carbon is being produced when we generate our electricity in order to understand what emissions our electricity and our heat pump sources are responsible for producing. And to do that, it's a bit complicated, and the story has changed over the years. But this graph charts the total emissions that come from all of the sources of our electricity production over the last, since 1996 here. So I've got in the dark blue, I've got my fossil fuels, so my oil power plants, my gas power plants, my coal power plants. I've got my nuclear power plants in yellow, the electricity that they're generating, and in all the greens, I've got all my renewable sources. So my hydropower that we've had for over 100 years, our onshore wind, our offshore wind, particularly offshore wind, we've had a huge uptake in, but some wave and tidal power, some solar power, some thermal renewable. And then in grey, I've got little bits of trading that we do that's a bit harder to track and all these things. But you'll see the picture overall of all the kind of different sources that have made up our electricity. In 1996, clearly a fossil fuel dominance and even a coal dominance within that. That one at the top is our coal part of the pie chart, part of the graph. So you'll see that coal really dominated, and even more so if I was to extend this graph backwards. Before 1996, you'll see coal really was the dominant power supply for electricity. So electricity was a really dirty fuel in the UK even in 1996. If I fast forward along to kind of 2014 at the bottom of this axis, you start to see this, what I'm going to term the rise of renewables. The green line starts to take up more of the area. We get more renewable generation is producing more of electricity. At the same time, coal is really being phased down. And as of this year, our last coal power plant was shut down in the UK forever. So there's no more coal producing any of our electricity, no more coal power plants producing any of our electricity in the UK anymore. And the effect that that's had is really significant on the carbon emissions associated with our electricity grid. And that's what I've tried to chart with this red line here. So this red line takes all those sources and says, well, what's your average for that year? For all the different sources that you use to generate electricity this year, what's the average? If you get lots of carbon emissions when you burn coal and none when you're getting electricity from hydropower plants, what was the total emissions that you got for that year, your average for that year? And this red line was really high when we burned lots of coal, because coal, as we all know, is really dirty, a really polluting fuel. When we burn coal, we get a lot of carbon emissions associated with that. So the average for the electricity grid was really high, and this red line was really high as a result. But in that kind of 2011 onwards, when this green really starts to ramp up, this red line falls really dramatically. The average emissions associated with our grid falls really dramatically. So much so that as of 2023, my latest data available, electricity is now responsible for less carbon emissions than even burning gas. So even though there's maybe around 40% of our electricity grid being provided by gas power plants, and even counting in some of the losses that we have from our electricity grid, so some losses in the distribution and transmission of our electricity, still using that electricity, even with 40% of it produced from gas, is a lower carbon source than burning the gas directly at the home. So we're now in a position we weren't previously, even in kind of 2020 and a little bit before then we weren't, but we now are. We're now in a position where our electricity grid is our lowest form of emissions, our lowest energy source of emissions, our lowest carbon source of emissions. By 2035, the UK government has targeted this to be almost zero. There is a small amount that's allowed. I think it's 0.001, some other zeros in there. It's a very small but very negligible amount of carbon emissions that are to be associated with our grid. So by 2035, the plan is that our electricity grid is this zero emissions energy source for us, that we'll be able to use that electricity however we need to without being responsible for any carbon emissions, at least from the sources. Obviously, there's some around the infrastructure and how we build all this equipment, but the actual source of energy, the source of electricity, would be from zero emissions electricity grid. Exactly how this mix will look is going to depend on the government choices in the next decade or so, whether we see more of this yellow nuclear in the graph, we see more of this green in the graph. Exactly what the split is going to look like remains to be seen. But the plan is that by 2035, there'll be none of this blue on this graph at all. All the electricity will be provided by zero emissions sectors. So really your choice is electricity. And it's especially exciting in this year of 2035. Apologies, I've put 2025 in this chart here, but it should say 2035. In 2035, I've reimagined this house, the typical house, and I've said that if I still heat that home with oil, well, I'm still responsible for roughly the same emissions as I would be today. I'm still burning the same amount of oil to produce the same amount of heat. Nothing's really changed in 2035. And similarly with the gas, I'm still responsible for about 2.8 tons of carbon dioxide every year just to keep my home nice and warm. But for electricity, there's almost nothing. I've going to zoom in, really heighten on the scale so you can see this 0.02 tons of carbon dioxide just to the oil and gas has gone off the chart, but electricity, you'll see responsible for really hardly any emissions associated with heating that home by using electricity, and a heat pump even less so. So much so that if we were to meet that 2035 target, there will be a 90% difference between the emissions associated with a heat pump and the emissions associated with a gas boiler in a home that needs the same amount of heating. So home otherwise exactly the same levels of insulation, household habits being exactly the same, a 90% difference in the amount of emissions associated with that home. And if we manage to convince everybody with a gas boiler to replace that gas boiler with a heat pump, that would reduce UK emissions from over 75 million tonnes to less than 8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. So really significant savings available to us if we opt for heat pumps. And even where we think heat pumps aren't suitable options, because they're not, there are some exceptions, there are some housing, there is some circumstances where heat pumps aren't the right option, electricity still has a really important and significant role to play because it's that low emission source. So really, try to summarize what are our options here is really just to think electricity, but the most efficient electric heating system is the heat pump. So that's why we end up thinking about heat pumps so much, is we know electricity is the source, and already today it's our lowest carbon energy source. We hope in time, or the plan is in time, by 2035, that will be an even lower carbon emission source. So we'll have a really green energy source available to us that we can use to heat our homes and do all the things we need to do to keep warm and comfortable, heat our homes and heat our hot water. Your options are electric heating, but obviously carbon's not the only thing to consider. You're also going to want to consider your running costs and all these other options and how much energy you're still using. And that's when the heat pump really demonstrates its role of just how efficient it can be. So heat pumps are the thing that we're always talking about because they use electricity, which is going to be a low carbon source, and they're the most efficient way of using that electricity to provide heat and hot water for our homes. So these are why they're our front runners and why they're so supported by governments, both in the UK and globally, why heat pumps are kind of emerging as the preferred option, but they're certainly not the only option. Anything kind of within that electric wheelhouse is going to have a role to play. So that's your options really.
Okay, that's great. And I'm sure we're going to get questions about how some of these non-heat pump things
Yes,
work.
for
But
sure.
we'll come back to them, I think, and ask a question about the heat pumps because one of the options we had on the poll was, why would you not want a heat pump? And it has often been said that people have heard stories or talked to somebody where the outside temperature gets to about 5 or 6 degrees C and the heat pump couldn't quite cope with it because of X factor, Y factor, etc. And so people are a bit nervous that they're going to spend a lot of money and be left with a still cold house
Yeah.
doing expensive spot heating. That's stories from existing heat pumps, if you like, probably more than 2 years old, most of these stories. What's been happening in heat pump technology? Has it been such that this is now not a problem, or is there still problems like this that have to be overcome?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's one I'd like to use by comparing heat pump adoption from kind of elsewhere. And I present this a few times to kind of advice organisations in Scotland. And so I wanted to for those characters, but I still think it's quite useful, even in a kind of UK context, is Scotland as part of the UK is the coldest part. So if we can get them working in Scotland, we can get them working in the rest of the UK. And what I wanted to do was kind of compare, well, why don't we have heat pumps everywhere in Scotland like we do maybe in other countries, and kind of what can we learn from other countries and their adoption. So I've picked Norway. The reason for that, partly there's quite a lot of similarities actually between Scotland and Norway. Both have long, cold winters. Both have frequent wind-driven rain. Western Norway is often wetter and windier than Scotland in any given winter season. And sub-zero temperatures are quite common, and particularly in areas of kind of Braemar, kind of the Northeast Highlands, kind of Aberdeenshire area, always the bit that gets the medal for the coldest winter, coldest part of the UK in any given year. So if we can get them working here in temperatures that are similar to Norway, maybe we can get them working. In terms of geography, the rural spread in small urban centres is quite similar to Scotland as well. It's probably a little bit more concentrated in urban environments in Scotland than it is in Norway, but it is still quite similar in terms of how many people are living rurally, islands far away, difficult to access, proper rural, and smaller cities, not kind of big. Neither of these countries have big international cities. Both have hard to treat housing stock in both countries. I probably do caveat that Norway housing stock is a bit better. It is more modern. Insulation standards are higher than they are in Scotland, but there is, does exist homes that are difficult to heat. Homes that are old, leaky, not well insulated do exist in both countries. And in terms of heating needs, a bit easier to compare Scotland versus Norway versus Scotland in a nice warm 30 degrees Greece that we've got someone from joining us from today, because both of these countries have really long heating needs for most of the year. And there's a few months of the year where we're lucky and we're given some warm weather, but for most of the year there's at least some heating need, and that can be especially so as we get into the depths of winter. And most historically have relied on oil or gas-based systems. They're both next door to the North Sea. They've both drilled to the North Sea for lots of oil, and they've both used that oil in their countries to heat their homes, or used the gas from the North Sea to heat their homes as well. So historically, they've used a similar heating system and made this transition over. So by the end of 2024, Norway, just need to move this out the road. Norway had approximately 1.5 million residential heat pumps, or around about 60% of households. I should say there's about 3 million people in Norway versus about 5 million people in Scotland. So population a little bit more in Scotland than there are Norwegians. But by the end of 2024, Norway had approximately 1.5 million residential heat pumps. Scotland, unfortunately, had just about 36,000 residential heat pumps, or only about 1% of households. So a huge difference in that. And just to explore this a bit further, it's not just Norway. So here on the left-hand side, I've plotted our average January temperatures for some European countries. So we've got the UK's average about 4.5, Ireland's about 5 degrees. And the darker blue it is, basically the colder it gets in January. So Lithuania, my darkest on the left-hand side, darkest blue, gets a very, very cold, minus 6.5 degrees is their average January temperature. Poland around minus 3.5, Finland minus 5. It gets very, very cold. East and northern Europe can get really cold January temperatures. And then the map on the right-hand side is some European countries with their heat pumps per 100,000 people, so normalized for their populations. But the darker green they are, the more heat pumps they've got per 100,000 people. So you'll see Norway out in front, around 29,000 heat pumps or almost 30,000 heat pumps for every 100,000 people. Sweden, around 22,000, 23,000 heat pumps for every 100,000 people. Finland, 24,000 heat pumps for every 100,000 people. Lithuania, I mentioned the coldest country in my left-hand chart. On my right-hand chart, around 4,000 heat pumps for every 100,000 people. The UK is the second last on this list at only 564 heat pumps per 100,000 people. The only one with less heat pumps is Hungary at only 141 heat pumps per 100,000 people. But we are second last on this chart, and we certainly don't have the coldest winters out of everybody. By European standards, we actually have quite mild winters. Certainly, it gets a lot colder in northern and eastern countries. So being cold isn't the reason we don't have heat pumps. And heat pumps can and do work at temperatures, below -6.5 as we have Lithuania, minus 15, minus 20. A heat pump can work in these temperatures. It's not a fault that they break down or can't deliver heat from these very low temperatures. And we know that partly because we understand how the heat pump works and how it extracts heat from these very low temperatures, but not just in theory, we can see it in practice. We can see there's a far greater adoption in all these cold countries. The cold weather isn't the reason. You might have a very good question to me. You might say, yep, well, I've been to Norway, Joanna, and they build their houses on stilts to get off the permafrost, and they build their houses with big thick insulation. Yes, absolutely, there are challenges in our housing stock to make heat pumps more attractive, but that they don't work in cold temperatures just isn't true. We do know that heat pumps can extract heat from very cold outside temperatures. Yeah, also from an engineering point of view, but also in practice, as we can see, the adoption in these very cold countries.
Okay. So I'm getting the message that basically most of us could move to a heat pump. Are there types of houses and accommodation where it won't work or won't be practical? So it's not so much, I guess, the technical word pump won't work, but it's
Yeah.
either not practical or there's some other reason. And could it be just really low standards of insulation mean it won't work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe one of the biggest hindrances to adoption, there are a few, but one of the biggest ones is the difference, particularly when we're trying to convince people to move away from gas heating over to heating is your energy bills. And no matter how much money that you have, nobody wants to be paying more than they have to for their energy bills. Everybody wants to make sure that they've got their energy bills as low as they possibly can to still have a nice, warm, comfortable house. Now, one of the big differences between these countries and our country is the difference in ratio between the gas and the electricity price. So there are countries with more expensive electricity than us. There are countries with more expensive gas than us. But we do have in the UK, one of the biggest differences between the electricity and the gas price. We're about 4 times the price right now. So for every unit of gas that you burn, you would pay around about 4 times the price for electricity. Now, heat pumps use electricity. They use it very efficiently. Usually for a heat pump install, for every unit of electricity it uses, it can push 3 units of heat into your home. So you can kind of divide your electricity price by 3 to kind of work out roughly what you're going to be paying per kilowatt hour for your heat rate from your electricity. But if we've got a ratio of 4 times, what we're trying to get is heat pumps to be 400% efficient, 4 times the efficiency, which is a huge ask of any heating system. But certainly the big ratio between electricity and gas is one of the barriers. Upfront costs is another key barriers, and disruption is another key barrier as well. Having to get this installed, finding a good installer, we don't have enough installers to meet demand, and being able to find, being secure that if it should break down, I can call someone and they'll be able to fit me in this week. That's something that we're really struggling with. We just don't have that installer supply chain base as well to serve the needs. So I think that needs to ramp up. We need to do something about the electricity and gas ratio for sure in order to make heat pumps more attractive. And we need to make that installation journey just a lot easier for people because it is a big change. There's lots to learn about it. And the more information and advice people can get to feel more confident about that change, I think is one of the barriers we'll need to get over.
So you're saying that, apart from just simply understanding what it is you're buying, there's actually sound problems. And so we've got energy market, gas market pricing is an issue.
Yes, and I
And
can maybe even, yeah, demonstrate this a little bit as well. Sorry, I've got a lot of charts and graphs with me today. Um, but average electricity prices, they do vary across the country depending on how you pay, but as a standard average typical rate, we're looking at around about 25.9 pence a kilowatt hour at the moment. Gas prices around 6.3 pence a kilowatt hour. So even if I take into consideration some losses in a gas boiler, you're maybe getting 92, 93% efficient gas boilers today. So modern gas boilers are very efficient. Heat pumps, I'm going to say 300% efficient. I will get a few groans from any engineers in the audience, but just in terms of electricity price to the heat that's coming out for every unit of electricity you provide that heat pump, you can expect about 3 units of heat out of that. But that still leaves me dividing that 25.9 by 3 rather than 4 in order to get kind of cost parity with the gas price. So we are demanding a lot more of our heat pump efficiency than we might be in other countries where that ratio is a lot smaller. So for instance, in Sweden, you'll see that that ratio is less than 1.5. So the difference between gas and electricity is just not as stark. They don't need the heat pump to be as efficient as that in order for it to be the more attractive financial option for them.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I can see Cynthia's asked a good question on that, but I'm going to come back to that. Um, One of the other points is this disruption, and
Yes.
none of us likes to change. I mean, I remember my father gave we had a oil and a gas boiler in the
Yeah.
1970s when oil got disrupted. So we put both in. So we were a dual-fired family home, which is unusual. Um, but I think the big thing was it's a disruption of potentially having to learn something completely new. And I know just
Yes.
moving to an electric car feels very strange. This seems like a much bigger change of habits. How much change will be needed typically to move to a heat pump? Do we have to think in terms of got to have more insulation? Do we need more physical space? Do we need different sorts of radiators? What's the biggest change physically people experience?
Yeah, sure. So for most people, the option that they'll be considering is something called an air to water heat pump, and we say that to differentiate it from something like the ground to water heat pumps, so heat pumps that are dug underground and use pipework, or air to air heat pumps, which are basically air conditioners but working in reverse. But the majority one will be the air to water heat pump. Now, in order to get that really good efficiencies, that 3 plus, and if you're somebody that's trying to get 4 plus or something to really help your running costs, reduce your running costs, really the secret is trying to get the flow temperature, the temperature in your radiators as low as you possibly can. Now, to do that without feeling cold inside, the ways that you need to do that is one, running your heat pump on for longer. So it's kind of on all the time, which is quite different to the advice we would give somebody with a boiler, but also that you have really big radiators. The bigger the radiator you can get, the more flow that can be going through it, the more it can dump that heat out without having to be so hot. In the UK, we're quite unusual in the way that we design our heating systems today. Most are designed to be around about 70 degrees, 80 degrees. Our radiators can be really hot when we have them up at maximum and we touch them and we're running that on a gas or oil based system. They can be really hot, they can be scalding. Some other countries don't have them running so hot, and they do have those slightly larger radiators to maybe accommodate temperatures at 50 degrees or 45 degrees or something that's not quite so burning hot. And certainly in care homes and heating systems where they do need to think a bit more carefully about not burning residents, heating systems are designed to run lower to make sure that there's not that scald risk and that they're protecting the people that live there. So we can do it. We can design heating systems that run at lower temperatures, but they do usually involve bigger radiators than people are maybe used to with the oil or gas. Now, I say big radiators, sometimes people panic and they start thinking, where on the wall am I going to be able to fit this radiator? Where's all this going to go? Sometimes it's just you've maybe got a single panel radiator in a room and you get one with a double panel. So it doesn't actually take up more room or more wall space. Every home is going to be different. Maybe you get 2 small radiators in the room instead. Maybe you get one larger one. But that's usually the difficulty is kind of working out where can we put a bigger radiator, and it's not so much what size do they need to be. It's just how big can you fit in with, and you'll work with your heating engineer to kind of design that. So it's not about trying to get to a certain size. If you can only have a small one in that room, that's fine. You'll maybe just need to accept that the heat pump can't be as efficient as if it were bigger. But it's really working with your your installer. The other big difficulty is the hot water tank. The combi boiler reigns supreme in the UK. Most homes have a combi boiler, and that means that your hot water and your heating are in one unit, one compact unit inside your house, and you don't have a hot water tank in the building. It wasn't the case even kind of 20, 30 years ago. There was hot water tanks, and airing cupboards were a much more standard feature of homes. But I guess particularly as house prices have increased, each pound per meter squared has increased. Everybody wants every maximum square inch that they're able to find inside their home, and giving up a cupboard space for a hot water tank can be quite a hurdle where you're going to stick all your stuff afterwards when you put that in. But you do need to find space for that hot water tank to go in order to be able to feed your baths and hot taps and everything. So yeah, radiator changes are one change that I would expect for most homes, and also finding a place for your hot water tank is the other kind of disruptive part. But altogether, installation mostly happens outside. The unit sits outside. It's pretty dust free in that case, and it can usually all be done with in about 3 days. So it's about 3 days installation, and all of that to be complete.
And a lot of people have got a sense that you need, well, call it technically, a lot of gubbins outside. You need a lot, like there's a lot of boxes, and it's going to ruin the front of your house or the back of your house, or it's going to be noisy. I mean, I'm a bit of a
Yeah.
podcast freak on this, and I understand there's been some very big improvements on that. But what are the sort of current latest edition heat pumps in terms of size and noise and
Yeah, so noise was something that has concerned a lot of people, and particularly in built-up areas. People were, concerned, especially if you've got lots of heat pumps all joining one street, and lots of heat pumps, could that end up being really, really loud? Typical heat pump, it is the same technology as your fridge. So if you kind of think about how noisy your fridge is kind of the way I would describe a heat pump. So when it's on, you kind of hear that click on, that hum, as the compressor's working, you'll hear that kind of hum. Most heat pumps are around about 40, 42 decibels. So that is, I need to remember my decibel chart, but it is quite quiet. It's about the size, like I mentioned, it's kind of about the noise of your fridge. And remember, that's outside as well, so it's not inside of your home, and that's a noise that's from outside of your home. There are planning rules around noise, and particularly making sure that you're not siting your heat pump too close to a neighbour so that they're not able to pick up on that noise. And while I would say they're quite quiet, they're not as loud as people think. I have come across really loud ones, and usually the reason has been it's not been steadied very well. So when the compressor starts driving, it starts rattling inside, and it just actually needed leveled out. Once it was leveled out, the noise went away. But I don't want you to take the impression that they're dead quiet. They're not. There is a noise with them, and that noise will be louder when it's generating hot water. In the winter, when it's kind of having to work its hardest, that noise will be louder. But it's also probably the times that you're most likely to be inside and not outside enjoying your garden anyway. So the chances of you hearing it is probably quite slim on a kind of normal given day. But there is a noise associated with them. In terms of their look, they're not really getting smaller. I would say that they are kind of maybe about the size of 2 wheelie bins. Is kind of my very a washer dryer unit together is the size of them. They probably could do, it's probably my message for manufacturers is to do a bit more to try and make them look a bit more sleek and polished and more attractive looking, because I think that is one of you're right, some of the complaints people have about them is I don't really want a metal box on the side of my home. It's, I spend lots of money on my plants and garden and trying to make it look pretty, and now I've got this metal box. But I think that could come, and there are some nice, expensive, but there are some nice colourful designs out there as well. I can send some links to manufacturers are trying to do them a bit more stylish as well. But for the standard heat pump, yeah, it's kind of like a metal box outside of your house.
Right. So I'm going to throw it open to questions in the chat. Right, you mentioned at the beginning these electric boilers, and Catherine's asked us about, is an electric boiler worth considering as an alternative? Something you mentioned was a flow boiler, a flow electric and a storage electric, and certainly those were terms that I wouldn't say I precisely understood. So
yes, let me explain what they
this.
are. So an electric boiler is like probably everyone here familiar with a gas or oil boiler. It's the same principle, but we're using electricity as our fuel rather than burning a gas or burning oil to provide that heat. So we're just a bit like an electric kettle, where we're sending electricity through a heating element and using that to heat our water. Now, they certainly work, and there are examples of them out there of electric boilers being used. My caution to that is electricity to power that boiler. The flow boiler just uses, sorry, I should explain what a flow boiler is and a storage boiler are first, and then I'll explain my cautions around those as heating systems. So the flow boiler, as you use electricity, it delivers that hot water into your house. So you set your timer. I want my home to be warm between 7 a.m. in the morning when I wake up, and I want it to stay warm until 10 p.m. at night when I go to sleep. It'll be using electricity to keep that water warm throughout that day. And every time the flow temperature drips a little, it'll top it back up and keep you going. The storage boiler has a small kind of buffer tank, a very small hot water tank that goes alongside it. And what it does is it heats up that hot water tank. So rather than the electricity providing it all at once, to the home all at once, it heats up that buffer tank, and then that buffer tank provides that hot water to the home. And that has the advantage of giving you a bit more flexibility about when you're using electricity. And that's kind of where the kind of key difference between why you might choose one or the other comes down to electricity prices. Now, the problem with electricity, as many of you know from our renewable sources, is we've got quite a lot of intermittent supply. We've got wind power or solar power. We're only getting electricity when it's windy. We're only getting electricity when it's sunny. Also, we're constantly trying to, or the national grid is constantly trying to balance our electricity supply and demand. So it does that by sending those signals out to rebalance the electricity demand. Now, one thing that's becoming quite attractive is this idea of flexible pricing, so that electricity would be more expensive during peak times when everybody else wants electricity. We could reduce demand by making it more expensive during those hours. So between the hours of 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. or these peak periods, we can make that more expensive. If you have an electric boiler, you need electricity then. You need to heat your home and run your bath and do whatever it is that you need to do. You don't probably have that much flexibility about when you need to do those activities, or few people have the flexibility of when they're going to be able to do those things. And so using that electric boiler means you're having to fund it at the electricity price that's potentially at peak times, or is that more expensive rate to be able to do that. So an electric boiler is a useful device, and it can deliver that heat, but I would always use it as a secondary to the heat pump. I would think about the heat pump as the primary source, and if the heat pump wasn't suitable for my circumstances, then I might think about the electric boiler, just because you've kind of only got that 1-to-1 ratio for the electricity price to the electric boiler. And also you can't really benefit from any of these kind of flexible tariffs because you need heat at the same time everybody else needs electricity. It's going to be quite difficult for you to shift that.
Okay, if it's okay with Jane, I'm going to jump to a couple of questions about prices and electricity,
Go
because
for it.
I mean the big message that's coming out for me is there's going to be more and more pressure on flexible pricing
Yes.
in the future. So if you haven't got your smart meter in, you can't take advantage of this, guys. So one of the questions is, if electricity prices were decoupled from gas prices and related to the actual cost of generation, would that help the uptake of heat pumps?
I suspect so, is the answer. So for anybody that's maybe not familiar with this, in the way we set our electricity prices in the UK is called something called marginal pricing. And it's important because what it does is it almost kind of auctions off, this is the amount of energy that we need. So if we needed 10 gigawatts of energy, right, wind supplier, you can provide it to me for 5 pence, and solar supplier, you can provide me another 2 gigabytes for 12 pence, and so on, and it goes until I get to my 10 gigawatts. The person who does that final bit, the person that takes me to that 10 gigawatts, sets the price for everybody else, and that's usually the gas supplier currently. So it's usually the most expensive fuel basically sets our pricing, and so our electricity prices are completely coupled, as Cynthia pointed out, to the gas price. If we can remove ourselves from that, well, I guess that system really works, and its key benefits is to make sure that we've always got the power that we need, and that's ultimately the fundamental principle of the electricity grid, is to make sure whoever needs power, whatever time that they need it, gets it, and we have that safe and reliable supply. So that's a really important aspect of the job that they do. But it's obviously quite an expensive thing when gas gets to set, and we're not really getting the benefits of all the renewables that we've helped fund through our taxes, joining the grid and getting that price. So there is discussion at government level to kind of understand how we can break apart from this market, and it's exactly to do that. It's to make electricity a more attractive offer, to make it priced more at the price of electricity and all the different sources that are making it up, rather than allowing the gas price or whoever's the most expensive energy provider to set the rate for everybody else, which is the difficult thing right now. So yes, absolutely, Cynthia. I think there's a huge possibility. It's just quite a difficult thing in order to make sure that the market's still incentive whenever we
Yeah,
need it.
yeah, yeah. I just had pictures of people waking the kids up at 3 in the morning to have their bath, turn. It's
It's
cheaper.
cheap now, come on.
Yeah. Um, So Eddie, as like, because several people here are electric car owners and probably are looking at the overnight
Yes.
tariffs being low. Obviously, you perhaps don't want your heat pump. But you're saying you want your heat pump on all the time, so you would at least be running your nighttime demand on a lower. But how might tariffs help with heat pump use, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where the insulation argument gets a lot stronger again. So you will meet people on kind of both sides of this that say insulation is so expensive and so fraught with problems. Damp issues when it's not installed very well and these kind of things. So let's just forget about trying to insulate every house in the country and focus on low carbon heat. And this is where I think the argument kind of falls apart, is when we start talking about the cost to deliver all this energy to people's homes. And overnight, just having the kind of electric vehicle style tariff where you've got the low overnight but more expensive daytime rate doesn't match a heat pump super well. As I mentioned, it is beneficial to keep your heat pump running overnight, but we would usually control it under something we'd call a setback temperature. So you're not having to heat it up to 20 degrees, you're maybe just heating your home to 15 or 16 degrees. So it's not going to be using a great deal amount of power overnight. It might heat your water overnight on that cheap rate, but you're probably not going to be heating your home overnight or a lot overnight. There are tariffs though called I think the main one is called Cozy, but there are other flexible tariffs as well that do give that cheaper rates overnight. Not usually as cheap as the nighttime rate, but they still give you cheaper rates in that kind of afternoon, early evening, up until about 5 p.m., which is usually when the peak period comes. And the more insulated your property is, the more you could benefit from that, because what you could do is time your heat pump to actually not run so much or have that setback in those few hours. And the better insulated that your property is, the more it'll hold on to that heat and not lose it so quickly, the less likely you need to have your heat pump running to retain that heat again. So insulation becomes more important when we start talking about this. But yes, absolutely, there are kind of other tariffs that make running a heat pump more attractive, and especially work if you've got a well insulated property.
Okay. And there's another message here about electricity prices. If it skews the cost and is more expensive, is it going to get cheaper electricity, or we get solar first and then use that to? And the second question from Catherine is about if you've got solar panels and storage batteries, can that help get the price lower for an electric boiler as you use the power from the batteries rather than the grid at the peak time? So you get
Yeah.
are there already tools there for effectively shifting demand to the cheaper time?
Yes, absolutely. So you could do this at the utility scale, I guess. You can have utility scale batteries that are supporting the whole grid, or as you mentioned, people at home are getting their own batteries at home and being able to do this at the householder level. And again, that stops you having to actually change your habits or your needs. Instead, you charge a battery and then you use that power from the battery whenever you want. Just to, I guess, David's point, will electricity get cheaper? Is it worth going solar? I would say if you want solar, go for it. But if the choice is, should I be spending my money on solar or the heat pump? I think that's sometimes where the question is actually, because obviously if you get both, that's a great deal. But it is an expensive undertaking to proceed with. That probably really depends on your motivations for doing it. If it's carbon related, the heat pump is the thing that's going to change your reduce your carbon emissions the most. Replacing your fossil fuel heating system with a low carbon heating system will reduce your emissions, but appreciate it's not just carbon that people have to weigh up in their mind. They also need to think about their costs. You're probably going to get that return on investment kind of concept from the solar quicker than you are the heat pump. But certainly if you can't afford both, that's a great way to go, and it can make the running costs of a heat pump very, very low indeed.
Mm.
And
Okay.
yeah, similar with the electric boiler as well. Yes. I guess the one thing around that is when the solar's generating and when your electric boiler is probably using its most, or opposite times of the year. So summer is the time that you're most likely to getting most power from your solar. Not that you don't get any in the winter, but you don't get nearly as much as you do in the summer. And in the winter, your electric boiler is likely to be doing most of its work. In the summer, it'll still be on to provide your hot water, but you're probably least likely to be using it. So that kind of offsetting can be difficult to do, even if the solar can generate a lot of the power that you'll need to heat your home. Trying to match them up is a very difficult thing to do. So you're likely still always going to rely on grid electricity, at least to some extent, no matter the setup that you've got.
Now, Cynthia asked earlier, my house has solid walls, so I can't insulate it. Is a heat pump feasible even in such a house?
I did it. So my house is a Victorian terrace property in a conservation area in Edinburgh. So all the things that they say you can't do, old Victorian property, solid stone walls, drafty, terraced, all the things you say you're not supposed to do in a conservation area. So I wasn't allowed to apply insulation even if I wanted to. That would have been against planning rules. I did it. They do heat old chicken coops and chicken barns, so things that are open to the world, they heat with heat pumps in order to make sure that the livestock and the right poultry are kept at the right temperature, comfortable temperatures. It's possible to heat anything with a heat pump. It's just that insulation makes that heating system cheaper to run, but that's true of any heating system. It's not a heat pump specific issue. If you add insulation to your house with an oil boiler, it's going to be less on the oil. The same is true with the heat pump. So if you can insulate, fantastic, you should do it. There's lots of benefits to it. But if you can't insulate because you've got solid walls and it's going to be an eye-watering figure, or it's going to cause issues, or there's historic things that you're trying to preserve or conserve about that property, and you've decided insulation's not right for you, that doesn't rule out a heat pump. It's just, yeah, we're thinking more now about the heat pump design inside. What size do the radiators need to be? What flow temperatures can we get to for that heat pump to be effective in that house? But yes, absolutely, don't let being in a solid wall property put you off. There's lots of examples of homes out there with solid walls heating effectively with a heat pump.
Okay. Good question from Frank. With a heat pump, can you vary the house's temperature at different times of day, or do you have a constant temperature?
No, you absolutely can alter it. What I would say to that though is quite often with our kind of traditional, at least Energy Saving Trust, our traditional advice for most households, with exceptions of course, but for most households, it's if you're going out for the day or you're going to sleep, you turn off your boiler, you switch off your boiler. You don't need the heat while you're not home, and it's cheaper to reheat the house even if it gets cold while you're away than it is to leave it on that low. The oil you're not burning or the gas you're not burning is always going to be the cheaper option than burning a small amount and having to burn up later. That's quite different with a heat pump in that the compressor will use a lot more electricity. It's a bit like the car reference we kind of use, the kind of revs. The more you're revving, the more the fuel consumption gets worse in your car. And it's similar with the heat pump. You've got this compressor, this motor. So the more work it's having to do, the bigger the jump it's having to do, the more electricity it uses. But if it can just kind of cover on a kind of simpler plane, then it won't use quite as much electricity and it'll be much more efficient. So usually our advice for heating controls inside the home or temperature controls inside the home is to try and keep the lowest comfortable temperature that you feel the home comfortable and pleasant at. So for most people, it's somewhere around 18 to 21 degrees. Depends how active and mobile people are, and everybody runs at different temperatures, don't they? But the lowest comfortable temperature that you are, if you're going to be asleep or you're out of the property for a long time, letting it fall back a few degrees to save a bit of energy is no bad thing, and it only has to then top you back up again by a few more degrees. But yes, you can have the house different temperatures. You can still do all the same kind of heating controls that you could with another home. I would just kind of caution if to get the best efficiency out of the system, you never want that heat pump kind of doing that big revs of jumping the house up 10 degrees in a short period of time, like you might demand from a gas or oil boiler.
Okay, now there is a question from Eddie, but I'm going to overrule him. For the first time ever in our 40 years of marriage, I'm going to overrule him and ask a question. Cooling. We've all heard that some of these heat pumps can be reversed and keep us cool, because those of us in the southeast are starting to get a teensy bit worried about the heat in the summer now. Is it are all heat pumps reversible? Is this something that is happening regularly now, or is this still something that's a bit of a pipe dream?
So air-to-air heat pumps, the ones that don't rely on wet radiators inside of the home, yes, that technology already exists and is used not super extensively in the UK, but elsewhere in the world, it's really normal. They're called air conditioners, and most of the world use them to both heat and cool their properties. So air-to-air systems, definitely, but air-to-air just isn't that common in the UK, at least not on the domestic level. Certainly in commercial buildings and offices and that kind of thing, it is quite standard. But as a home heating solution, not that common yet, but certainly can be done. There will be people out there doing it and can run cooling and heating. Cooling with a air to water heat pump, unfortunately, would cause problems. Um, I guess technically it is that you get condensation. So as the heat, the water vapor cools inside your radiator, the water vapor will turn into liquid. It'll condense onto your radiators, and you'll end up with wet areas inside of your home. So would not recommend, and they're not going to be installed as a standard as a kind of air to water way of cooling your home. So the heat pump that you're installing this way to heat your home isn't going to be able to do cooling, but the air to air heat pump certainly can do cooling.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Jane, I think we're at our end. We've had some super questions and super info. I'd like to say a personal, very big thank you to Joanna, but also to everybody for all your questions. I'm going to hand over now to Jane to round us up. But could I ask for a round of applause for Joanna before we go to
Oh,
Jane?
thank you very much,
Absolutely.
Rosie.
Thank you
Cheers.
so much, Joanna. You've filled us up with a huge amount of information. I've heard talks about heat pumps before, but you filled us in with some really, really useful stuff. And I think beginning at the beginning, the way you did with, sort of what are the options and why would you choose a heat pump was actually really useful. Because as you said, sometimes people just jump in with that and you think, well, hang on a minute, is that the only possibility? Um, so no, really, really, thank you very much indeed. Anybody here who has further questions that they didn't think of during the talk, would you object to me giving them your email address so that they could ask you a question?
Not at all. Go for it. Yeah, go for it, Jane. No
Okay.
problem.
So anybody who wants to ask further questions that they didn't get around to thinking about, anybody who would like to be on our mailing list so you get to hear about future talks, do either put your email address in the chat, or we have an email address which I will put in the chat, and you can write to me on that. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you everybody for coming and for your excellent questions. And we really look forward to seeing you again next month.
Yeah. May I, Jenny?
Yes, go for it,
Yeah.
Nayati.
Yeah, I just want to ask, excellent session actually. I am from India, but I think here in UK, I know there is a very cold, so the people are using. But here in India, north side, Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, I visited my friend's home, and I was there for months, and literally the people are also using the heat pumps to warm up. But the thing is, I would like to know. Are the heat pumps are eco-friendly?
In terms of building the heat pump itself, is that the question? So this is a great question, because many years ago, no. If you'd asked me this maybe even 10 years ago, the fluid inside. Quite often when people describe how a heat pump works is they'll say it works a bit like a fridge in reverse, and it does sound a bit confusing because I don't think the analogy ever quite sat with me well, but it is using that refrigerant, and that's how it's able to work, is the refrigerant's been circulated and is extracting heat. You might remember the ozone scare, so all the CFCs that were being used, a lot of that was in refrigerants and aerosols and these kinds of equipments. This is what we used to use in heat pumps. These CFCs used to be what's used, but they've worked really hard in replacing refrigerants. So much so now that there's two kind of key refrigerants that you'll see in most common heat pumps installed today. One's called R32, one's called R290, very low global warming potentials. I'll sorry, I've lost all my graphs, but I will can send those over. You can see the dramatic difference in them. So these F gases, at least in the UK, are now very regulated. Only F-gas engineers can work with them, and they have to document anything that gets released. But the global warming potential of the refrigerant, which is the key thing that wouldn't make them eco-friendly, is what's reduced a lot. So modern heat pumps, not without anything that's manufactured does have its problems, but certainly a much greater than it was even maybe kind of 20 years ago with the refrigerant choices that we've got available to us today. So the refrigerants are much lower on the global warming potential than they used to be. And a great question, thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. I think we'll close there.
Yeah.